The Child by L.A. Lewis. Because I am not a member of the Psychic Research Society, and because I have never attempted to write a work of reference on occult subjects, I do not arrogate to myself any claim as an authority on such matters. Therefore, I shall not put forward a so-called scientific explanation of my experience at Wailing Dip, preferring to leave this task to anyone clever enough to recognize the place from my account. Its real name, of course, is different. Naturally, I've read a mint of other people's efforts, both serious textbooks and works of fiction, but in spite of all the mass of conjectures about spirit manifestation which they have contained, I am left guessing as to whether what I encountered in that revolting house was a spirit craving incarnation and angered by cruelly thwarted desire, or some monstrous survival, if anything more horrifying still. I got let in for the business entirely through my own curiosity, having always been keen on tales of the supernatural. I happened to be making a trip on my motorcycle to spend a couple of weeks with an old school friend on the other side of England, and, having plenty of time to spare, was amusing myself sidetracking from the main road, wherever the countryside looked most attractive, in the hope of discovering some of those really old-world villages that one may still occasionally unearth in these days of the char-a-bang and filling station. Wailing Dip, its real name is equally quaint, proved to be one of these, that I suppose I should have eventually paid it a lengthy visit, even if my machine had not elected to break down badly just as I arrived. As it was, I found that it would be quite 2 days before the nearest garage could get spares from London and have me ready for the road again, and as I was still far from my destination, I decided to stop and supervise the job. I accordingly wired my friend that I was hung up, and went to arrange accommodation at the village inn. The latter was in every way in keeping with the place itself. A dear little half-timbered cottage with delightful rose gardens at the back, extending to the borders of a dense wood. The landlady, an old-fashioned, motherly sort, who told me she had been running the place with the help of her 2 daughters since her husband's death 6 years before, made no difficulty about giving me a bed, and it was not long before I had collected my bag from the carrier of the motorcycle, washed my hands and face over the sink in the back kitchen, and taken a pint of beer out to a little table in the garden, where I relaxed myself to that particularly keen enjoyment which only a summer evening in the heart of the country can give. Mrs. Jackson, as I will call the landlady, came out about half an hour later to see if I wanted any more ale, and her daughters, apparently being able to cope with whatever business was in the tap room, stayed talking for some little while. After I had told her a few things about myself, where I was bound for, and how I came to be passing through the village, I remarked on my appreciation of a place so wonderfully restful and off the beaten track, and began to question her about the locality. "Seeing that the spares I'm held up for can hardly get here before tomorrow evening," I said, "I should like to spend the day exploring the neighbourhood, and perhaps you can advise me if there are any places of special interest that I ought to see." She mentioned 1 or 2 old churches within a 5-mile radius, in addition to Gormingley Park, the seat of the local county family. She feared, however, that I would not be able to look over the last-named place, since the family were in residence. They were, she explained, the chief landowners of the district, Wailing Dip itself being all part of the property. "The squire's one of the best," she added. "Old-fashioned, like the village. He's never yet turned out a tenant who couldn't pay his rent, so long as it was really a case of hard luck or illness. And as for trespassing, why, the village folk can come and go as they like on his estate, outside the gardens, of course, and he'd never summons them, not unless they're poaching." "Well," I replied. "If that's the case, I think I'll spend an hour or two at least, rambling in that wood. It looks beautiful, and no distance to walk." As Mrs. Jackson made no reply, I turned to look at her, and found to my surprise that she was staring at me with an expression of the utmost concern. "Don't go in that wood, sir," she said, almost in a whisper. "There are plenty of others as pretty." But good Lord, what's the matter with the place? For I could read positive fear in her eyes. And then I added, for the sake of saying something, "It's an old-fashioned district, but surely you don't date back to dragons." "Well, there you go, sir," she retorted, almost angrily, "laughing at everything before you even know what it is. Just like the present generation." Then, realizing that I might be offended, for, after all, she'd only known me an hour, she went on with rather a forced smile. "You young gentlemen from the big cities today don't believe in anything you can't see and touch, so I'm not going to say any more, but speaking for myself, I wouldn't go in that wood alone for £1,000, and if you want to laugh, sir, you may, but I still won't go." I was intrigued. This smelt like something really worth investigating. "Mrs. Jackson," I said, "because I arrive in this village on a motorcycle, a form of transport I detest, but can afford, don't class me with the type that carries a leggy flapper on the pillion and sports a cigarette holder a yard long. Believe me, I have really quite a serious mind. I have never seen a ghost, but would like to. I certainly don't laugh at them. You obviously have a good story to tell. Now be an equally good soul, get me another tankard, bring yourself just what you feel like, and spare a bit more time to tell it." I had to say a lot more to convince her of my earnestness, but eventually elicited an unpleasant piece of local history, which would have been interesting enough even without a sequel. It appeared that, situated near the middle of the wood, which was 100 acres in extent and very dense, there was a gamekeeper's cottage, which had been inhabited by the same family in the squire's employ for an indefinite period, the job of safeguarding that particular covert having passed from father to son for several generations. The last gamekeeper, however, had never had any children, and on his death, only 7 years ago, a North Country man and his wife had been taken on to fill the vacancy. The man, according to Mrs. Jackson, had been quite a decent sort, if just a bit morose and unwilling to mix with the village people, but his wife, though good-looking, had aroused an antagonism soon amounting to hatred from the first moment she appeared. She was extremely selfish and greedy for money, and seemed to derive no pleasure from looking after the cottage for her husband, with whom, it was said, she continually had the most frightful scenes. Unlike him, she was not averse to the society of her fellow creatures, nor was she above coming into the inn unescorted and drinking gin copiously with any poacher or passing tramp who would join her. At these times, when her tongue was loosened, she made no secret of her opinions as to the dead and alive character of the village, the shamefully humble nature of her husband's work, and the even more shameful smallness of his wages. Some of the older women in the village had tried to reason with her, pointing out that many others were satisfied with similar occupations on the squire's land, and found their men's pay ample to bring up a happy family into the bargain. To which she flashed out that she wanted no squalling brat to guzzle the money that was already insufficient for two. Presently, however, the word went round, as such things will in a small community, that she was undoubtedly going to have a baby, and many were the hopes expressed that its advent would soften her and bring out the good, which must be somewhere in her nature. In due time the child was stillborn and buried a few days later near the village churchyard, the father alone attending the funeral. When the wife was able to be about again, it was at once seen that no good had come of her experience. Rather, she was more slovenly and discontented than ever, and began to pay more frequent visits to the tap room. Some pitied her, putting down her behaviour to the sense of fruitless travail. Others swore, by her own former statement, that she was glad to have no extra mouth to feed. A few hinted that the child had not been stillborn. The following year she brought another one into the world, with the help of an old midwife who had attended all the births in the village for half a century, but who had not been called in the first time. It lived a fortnight, and was found by its father, suffocated in its cradle, the day after the old cottager had gone back to her home. The wife said that she had been out in the wood for an hour chopping sticks, and that the baby must have turned over in its sleep. The third year there came another, and this too met with an untimely end, being found with its neck broken on the floor beneath the cradle, which stood on a comparatively high trestle table to be, as the mother explained, less easy for the cat to reach. By this time, everybody was talking, which, considering the woman's reputation, was not surprising. And when the following year a fourth tragedy took place, the 2-month child this time having no marks to indicate the cause of death, an inquest was held by the express order of the squire. The post-mortem revealed that some sharp, thin instrument, such as a hat pin, had been passed through one of the eardrums into the brain, and that traces of any external bleeding must have been carefully washed away after the flow had ceased. A verdict of willful murder was recorded against the mother, and the case passed on to the next assizes, where she was found guilty but insane and sent to an asylum. Her husband then threw up his job and left the neighbourhood, and the village concluded that the terrible drama it had witnessed was at an end. There was, however, one more act to come. Several months later, the woman made her escape, and though the asylum authorities tried to keep it dark while attempting her recapture, the fact leaked out owing to her being seen by a courting couple entering the wood at Wailing Dip. Suspecting what had happened, these young people notified the village constable, who, through his county station, confirmed the escape. He also learned that the convicted murderess, who it must be remembered had not committed her crime until her last-born was 2 months old, was once more an expectant mother. A search party was formed, and had already spent some hours beating the side of the wood adjacent to the village, when word came through that the fugitive had been seen emerging on the far side, and making her way towards a desolate stretch of moorland, known as the Great Waste. Further scouring of the wood was thereupon called off, and those of the search party who were willing to continue their services were taken round to the new starting point in police cars. To cut a long story short, the mad woman was never captured. She had had nearly 2 hours' start from the time she left the wood, owing to the fact that her second witness, not knowing of the hue and cry, had failed to report seeing her leave it. With the assistance of bloodhounds, she was traced to the edge of one of the abysmally deep potholes which dot the moor in that region. Failure to pick up the scent from that point was proof enough that she had either jumped or fallen into the abyss, and there the matter had to rest after a few half-hearted attempts to descend with ropes and lanterns. But ever since then, Mrs. Jackson concluded, the feeling has grown round here that the wood and the cottage are haunted, and I doubt if a solitary soul has stepped inside its boundaries these 2 years. excepting one poacher from a hamlet 20 miles away, who went there after pheasant and came into me for the stiffest drink I'd got. That scared he couldn't, or wouldn't, tell exactly what he'd seen. But, I said, doesn't he sometimes shoot over it? Mrs. Jackson shook her head. Since that night, sir, there's never been a game bird in the whole covert. Never a fox, never even a badger, as far as I know. You could stop with me a 12-month and you'd never hear the cry of one. Night or day. Plenty in the other woods, but not this side of the house. Besides, she dropped her tone to a whisper. It's not only what doesn't live in the woods, sir. It's the poultry and things that's killed and taken away from the village, sir, by something that comes out of the wood. So people say. But good God, I ejaculated. What do they think it is that haunts the wood? Your story is horrible enough in all conscience without the final touch about stolen chickens, which are most likely taken by foxes. But has anyone ever seen a ghost there? If so, what's it like? Is it the mad woman herself, or the poor little wretches she destroyed? Surely they would excite more pity than fear. Mrs. Jackson looked at me fixedly for a long, long moment before she answered. And twice I thought she was about to speak, and twice she failed. Then, at last, I have seen nothing, sir, and I don't think there is another woman or man in the village who has, because we have never stepped through the fence since that night she died. It is just the way we feel, and as I have told you, sir, I for my part will not for £10,000. But the poacher, I cried out, the man from 20 miles away who was after pheasants. Once more she looked at me fixedly in the same compelling silence. He died, sir, within the month of drink and delirium, shouting out the words he first uttered when he staggered into my kitchen, long after I'd closed the bar. The child. Oh God, the horrible child. As may be imagined, this revolting story did more than fire my imagination for a ghost hunt. So graphically had Mrs. Jackson told it, and in so obviously certain was she in her own mind that some dreadful curse or haunting had been left in the wood, that I found myself visualizing the murder, or murders, with uncomfortable clarity. And although I enjoyed the excellently cooked supper, which I later consumed in a cosy, lamp-lit parlour, I quite failed to derive the anticipated comfort from my night's rest in a little lean-to room which I had at first much admired, notwithstanding the old-fashioned luxury of a feather bed. My window, for one thing, looked out upon the wood, and I must confess that my brain persisted in speculating on what I should encounter there the next day, for I had determined to reconnoitre it when full daylight should give me confidence. Towards morning I slept a little, my rest broken by half-waking dreams of weird, formless things watching my window from the gloom of the thicket. I rose early and breakfasted well, telling Mrs. Jackson that 1 o'clock would suit me admirably for lunch. Then, carefully leaving my cap behind, for I knew that she would otherwise ask my destination and try to dissuade me, I strolled out, ostensibly to admire the garden. Once there, I quickly got out of sight among the pergolas, and was soon through the wire fencing. My first action, after progressing some yards among the trees, was to produce my penknife and cut a stout branch from an ash sapling, which I trimmed to a length of 3 feet. This imparted a measure of comfort, and would be useful for poking into hollow trunks or killing possible adders. For one half of me never expected results in the ghost hunt, and sought to treat the expedition as a nature study ramble. The thickness of the undergrowth amazed me, since the upper foliage was extremely luxuriant, and I had noticed in other woods that such a condition usually killed off ground vegetation through lack of sun. Here, apparently, the soil, some kind of dark loam, was sufficiently fertile to counteract this tendency, so that, what with trailing brambles and wild briars, and thick curtains of creepers falling from higher branches, progress was really hard. I remember thinking, too, that it was for the same reason quite the gloomiest wood I had seen, a place of perpetual twilight, even in this glorious June weather. I had made up my mind to seek out the cottage first, and then, if it revealed nothing of interest, to spend the rest of the morning idling about after insects and wild flowers. So, remembering that it was near the centre of the wood, I endeavoured to keep a course at right angles to the border from the point of entry. No easy matter in so tangled a thicket. At last, however, I burst through a screen of dead brushwood into a kind of leafy tunnel, much overgrown, but clearly a path. Just to my right, another track branched off on the opposite side, roughly in the direction I had been following, and after a moment's thought I took to it, beating the brambles aside with my stick as I went along. All this time, but for the occasional clatter of a wood pigeon taking flight 40 feet ahead, I realized that I had been progressing in a most uncanny silence. There had been no birdsong, no scuttling of rabbits or rats, and never a sign of a squirrel. The fact dawned on me queerly, and I began to look round more carefully for traces of wildlife. There were, I observed, plenty of old nests in the bushes, and I had already stumbled in more than one rabbit hole. But whether any rabbits slept in the warrens underground, or whether they had been killed, or driven out by fear of the unknown thing at which Mrs. Jackson had hinted, I could not guess. Despite the warmth, I shivered and tramped on along the winding path. Then, round a sharp bend, I was suddenly confronted by the cottage. A grey stone building, slate-roofed, and almost buried in a mass of ivy. Unlike most of those deserted dwellings, its windows were intact, though, of course, uncurtained, and the fact that the front door stood wide open, mute testimony to the last gamekeeper's state of mind when he took away his sticks of furniture, almost lent the place an air of immediate habitation. The cottage was much larger than I had expected, having 2 stories, and I stood gazing at it for quite a minute before approaching further. Then, acting on some impulse of caution that I have never quite defined, I removed my shoes and stole in absolute silence across the small clearing until I stood on the front step, peering into the cobwebby little hall. The benefit I might have expected from the break in the trees forming the dwelling site was negated by the obvious fact that the fine spell was at an end, for during my short journey the sky had become obscured by thunderclouds, so that the interior of the house was no lighter than the thicket through which I had come. But for this, I might have seen the baby handprints in the dust before I heard the cry. As it was, the sound reached me first, and I stiffened against the lintel in sheer astonishment. Da, 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 came clearly in a childish treble from somewhere upstairs, accompanied by the rhythmic thumping of some hard object on the bare boards. I stood absolutely petrified. It was so unmistakably the babble of a very young child that has not yet learnt to speak, and yet Mrs. Jackson had said definitely that no one lived in the place, or indeed would venture near it. Still, someone must obviously be residing here, unknown to the village, and I was about to announce myself with a "Hello there," when I realised that if so, they must be purposely in hiding, perhaps from the law, and closed my lips. It was then that I glanced down and saw the little hand marks in the dust on the red tiles. They made definite tracks in all directions, crossing and recrossing each other, many of them partially smudged out where the baby's knees had followed, as it had evidently crawled on all fours. Some traversed the step on which I was standing, indicating that it had been outside the cottage as well, and quite recently too, for there was not a speck of dust on these more clearly visible impressions. It struck me then, for which I could not quite account, since the matter was more odd than terrifying, that every single imprint I could see had been made by the child itself. Nowhere was there the least sign of an adult footprint, and yet such thick dust must have lain many days. I could have believed months since the last sweeping. I frowned thoughtfully, and began tiptoeing across the flags to the foot of the stairs. After all, I was not going back at this point without solving the mystery, and if these queer people were, as they must be, fugitives from justice, they could not prosecute me for trespass. Whilst, should they prove aggressive, I still had my ash plant and a strong arm. By this time, the great storm which had gathered so speedily since I set out began to break, and, after a preliminary flash and distant rumble of thunder, a deluge of rain poured out of the sulphurous skies, its impact on the surrounding trees making a sullen, monotonous roar, above which I could still faintly hear the thumps of the child playing in the upstairs room, and its shrill "da, da, da." My own muffled footfalls were quite inaudible, and so, hastening them, I stood a few seconds later on the almost pitch-dark landing, outside the hall open door of the room from which the noise was coming. There was more light inside the room than in the hall below, the surrounding trees on that side of the house being somewhat stunted, and I could see quite distinctly the half that was visible through the doorway. Like the rest of the place, it was totally unfurnished, but close against the wall to the right, I noticed with astonishment a tumbled heap of carcasses of what appeared to be hens, rabbits, and other small creatures, furred or feathered. Some just white skeletons, but others more or less lately killed, and strangely gashed and mutilated. A disgusting odour of rottenness emanated from the heap, and the floorboards all around seemed to be streaked with great gouts of blood. I think it was at this juncture that I felt my first thrill of real horror, as I asked myself into what hellhole I had wandered, where a little child played among the putrid bodies of birds and beasts, and there was still no sign of parent or nurse, depraved beyond measure though such a person must be. But the sight that met me as I at last nerved myself to peer furtively through the crack of the hinge was the most weirdly unbelievable of all. Seated in the middle of the floor, with its back to me, was the naked figure of a baby of perhaps 2 years, prattling wordlessly in its sing-song treble as it played with a pile of gleaming white objects arranged about it in a circle. One of these, a globular thing of peculiar configuration, it grasped in its right hand and banged down noiselessly among the rest. Opposite, just discernible in the shadowy corner, sat the largest brindled cat I had ever seen, dreamily watching the play through half-closed, flame-yellow eyes. I suppose it must have been minutes that I stood there, dumbfounded, staring at this incredible spectacle, before my dazed senses registered its full hideousness. And then a strangled gasp escaped me, for I saw that the toy in the child's hand was a tiny human skull, and that all the other white things were the various bones of an infant skeleton. Slight as it had been, my involuntary intake of breath broke the spell that had enfolded that dreadful room. With a hellish scream, the cat leapt to the open door, glared at me in bestial rage, and bounded past me down the stairs, whilst the child dropped the skull and sprang with almost equal agility to the heap of rotting carcasses. There it paused, and, with no further sign of panic, slowly turned its face to mine. That was not only the most ghastly moment of my life, but the most faith-killing. I would not have believed it possible for such a stark fear to engulf a human mind without destroying it. One can visualize the malignant expression of a brute desperado who never knew care or kindness, making his last stand for life. One can picture him equally unleashing all his lust, malice and cruelty on defenseless women in time of revolution, and one only looks at him with anger and loathing, tempered, if one is very, very just, by pity that his loving child soul was crushed before it could develop. Somehow one always knows, pretty fancies apart, that he was once a child, loving and asking love. This thing that confronted me in that place of death was spawn of hell, a foul thing, the greatest contradiction of faith that human eyes have ever beheld. It had the body of a child and the expression of the most frightful fiend. As I watched, petrified with terror, these thoughts tumbling tumultuously through my brain, I saw its malignant eyes light up with an unholy inner glow of triumph. And I saw one of its miniature hands delve down into the carcasses and come back bloody and holding a filthy, old, common kitchen knife. It gave a little babyish chuckle, infinitely horrible, and began to crawl towards me. And in the same moment I knew by some strange sense, without daring to look away, that the great cat was creeping stealthily up the stairs behind me, its head swinging from side to side, and its baleful yellow orbs fixed with dreadful purpose on the back of my head. Shrieking like a frightened beast, I sprang backwards, twisting in the air as I went, and the next thing I can remember is running on and on, in the drenching rain, down one of the forest paths, whipping my face to ribbons on the thorns and nearly bursting my tortured lungs. They told me, when I was better, that I said nothing understandable during my period of delirium, for which I was glad. As I stated at the commencement, I do not know if what I saw was a spirit or an unthinkable survival, that of the fifth child, born as the woman passed through the wood on her way to death on the moor. After all, chickens feed themselves from the moment of hatching. The fact to be remembered is, however, that I will not divulge the real name of the place, for if I did, I should somehow be compelled to join another search party, and I could not bear to look at the child again. Today's story was The Child. Lewis. It was read by Jasper L'Estrange. I do hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, sweet dreams.